I'm Morgan Rector, host of the Human Monsters True Crime Podcast. Do you find life boring within the comfort zone? This is the right show for you. It will test your endurance. The offenders profiled are among the most inhumane. These people specialize in the unthinkable. Human Monsters, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, my name is James Garbarino, and I had a PhD in human development from Cornell University in 1973. Over the decades, I've worked as a professor in a number of universities, Penn State, Loyola University, Chicago, Cornell University. But throughout my career, I've always had one foot in the university and one foot in the broader world. For many years, that was particularly children growing up in war zones around the world. But for the last about 30 years, I've also done work as a psychological expert witness in murder cases. And that grew out of my work on trauma and the impact of violence. So that's sort of my story. I retired from teaching a couple of years ago, but I'm still very active in the expert witness activities around the country.
So you specialize in studying what causes violence in children, which I'd like to pick your brain about a little bit, if you don't mind. And starting off, what would you say the top three common denominators are when it comes to violence in children that you've seen?
Well, it's always hard to provide complete generalizations because every life has a specific pathway. But certainly the experience of trauma and abuse and maltreatment, emotional, physical, sexual, is certainly one of the prime risk factors for going down that pathway. You do find individuals who were treated well, treated supportively, who end up committing acts of violence, but clearly that's a huge risk factor. If you could prevent child abuse, you would prevent a lot of violence down the path. And that's evident even in, I think, some very interesting research about sort of genetic vulnerabilities. That, for example, there's a gene called the MAOA gene that affects how people respond to and deal with stress. Well, when that gene is sort of turned off, and it creates a vulnerability, but that vulnerability remains latent for the most part until you confront an abusive family. So in the sort of classic study of this, kids who had the gene turned off and thus were vulnerable and lived in abusive families, by the time they were 10, 85% of them already were showing a chronic pattern of aggression, bad behavior, acting out, violating the rights of others. If the gene was turned on, so they had the normal level of this brain chemical, this neurotransmitter, the rate was about 42%. But the really interesting thing in the study is if they're not abused, then the gene becomes irrelevant. There's no difference whether it's turned on or turned off. And for me, that's a kind of model for much of this, that you have to look at the context in which any single thing is occurring. So that's certainly one. The second one, I think, is the sort of cultural, societal context that you're in. And as people living in the United States, we're unfortunately loaded up on cultural risk factors for violence. I'll give you two examples. The odds that somebody will die in an assault increase dramatically if there's a gun involved. It takes something like a drive-by shooting. It's hard to imagine a drive-by stabbing. I mean, theoretically, you could run around and jump out of a car and stab people, and it has happened. But once you introduce guns into the equation, particularly guns that fire a lot of bullets, it becomes much easier to translate aggressive impulse into dead bodies and damaged bodies. Another, and I think fascinating example of that, it has to do with people who have schizophrenia. Now, most people, if you say a crazy person, what they're thinking of typically is somebody with schizophrenia, somebody who hears voices, who has delusions. Maybe they wear a aluminum foil hat to avoid the aliens in their attic from beaming messages into their heads. But about half of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia hear voices. It's called auditory hallucinations. There's a study that came out relatively recently, just a few years ago, that may be the first study that really asked, what are the voices telling them? Because people thought, well, these are voices in people's heads. Why should it matter? Or should there be any systematic effect? Well, this study compared the content of the voices in the United States, in India, and in Ghana, which is a country in Northwest Africa. And what they found was in the United States, 70% of the voices were telling them to commit acts of violence against themselves or others. In India, it was only 20%. In India, most of the voices were telling them to do things like clean your house better. And in Ghana, only 10% of the voices were telling them to commit acts of violence. There, most of the voices were understood to be sort of positive conversations with God. So, to me, this is a startling thing because we think of schizophrenics as being cut off from reality. But here's some evidence that they're absorbing the reality of violent imagery in the United States. So I think that certainly would be number 2 on my list, as sort of cultural, societal context in which you're living out your life. And then the third thing is probably situational things. For example, if you grow up on the south side of Chicago, the odds that you'll end up joining a gang are astronomically greater than if you grow up in an affluent suburb on the north side of Chicago. And just that fact alone, if you're in a gang or not, if you're in a community where gang violence is common or not, that increases the odds dramatically that you will be involved in an act of violence. So those are 3 that I would point to as I think being pretty powerful.
So do you believe there's ever any instances in which a child cannot be habilitated or rehabilitated, talking juvenile justice?
Well, in my 2018 book, Miller's Children, which is about successful rehabilitation and positive transformation in adolescents who are involved in murder, there is a chapter called Are There Exceptions? Because I think there are exceptions, and they're grossly in 2 categories. The first is kids who are so profoundly damaged early in life that they never have a chance to develop what we might call the normal range of human thinking, feeling, behaving. If you're savagely abused in the first 3 years of life, it's like a frontal assault on the very process of becoming a human being. And I think in most all of those cases, the damage is so profound that you have nowhere to build from. A guy in prison I was talking to once said to me, how can I become rehabilitated if I was never habilitated in the first place? And that sort of, this speaks to that rehabilitation implies you're going back to something. So I'm always looking for something positive for them to go back to. But if you have none of that, it's really starting from scratch. And I think in many cases, it's just not feasible. We don't know how to do that. The other group, I think, are true psychopaths, individuals who have no capacity for empathy, who are totally cut off from the moral framework of life. The original meaning of psychopathy or being a psychopath is moral insanity. And that captures it, that you just don't have a moral framework. You see everything in terms of tactics and your needs and your desires. I mean, for example, there was a study in Canada where they thought they would teach empathy skills to prison inmates, thinking this would be a good way to improve the quality of their relationships. When they analyzed the data, it was a very weak effect. Somebody said, you got to go back and reanalyze the data separately for the psychopaths and everybody else. And what they found was for everybody else, the empathy training program did improve their relationships. But for the psychopaths, they treated it as a workshop on how to improve your manipulation skills. Because in effect, the message was, oh, I can understand you better, not so I can be kind to you, but I can more effectively take advantage of you. So this is a very powerful thing. And of course, that gets into the question of, where psychopathy or where psychopaths come from. To what extent is that a consequence of their experience? to what extent is that a reflection of their underlying sort of moral equipment, emotional equipment. I mean, for example, there's studies of what are called mirror neurons. And typically babies have these mirror neurons, which is why if a baby hears another baby crying, it sort of sets off distress in his brain or her brain, and the second baby starts crying. You can imagine if you don't come equipped with these mirror neurons, it's like you're lacking one of the basic building blocks for empathy later in life. So there may be, there's sort of brain issues in people who are vulnerable to becoming psychopaths. It's a very discouraging area because generally people think you can't rehabilitate psychopaths, you can only control them. And there's at least one study, I think from Minnesota, with teenagers who scored high on a sort of psychopath score, not the very highest, but high enough to be worried about them. And they were able to retrieve them or get them to be pro-social. But it required a therapy program that was 6 days a week, several hours a day for months and months and months, which is commensurate with the fact that you're starting from scratch. You're trying to teach somebody to do something that they don't naturally learn how to do. So those are the two, I think, exceptions. When the Supreme Court ruled in Miller versus Alabama, they said that life without parole should not be applied to teenagers who commit murder, because the presumption, the default option is that they are capable of rehabilitation and positive transformation. But they did leave open the idea that in what they called, quote, the very rarest of cases, there could be a sort of permanent incorrigibility that would mean you couldn't rehabilitate them. One of the problems with that, of course, is that prosecutors, judges all around the country want to include most of the teenagers in that category. But the Supreme Court said, no, that's the very rarest of cases. I mean, there was a case that came up in Arizona, Tatum versus Arizona, where I think it was the first 6 resentencing of juveniles cases, they simply reimposed a life sentence. And when it got to the Supreme Court, they said, wait a minute, we said this is the very rarest of cases. How can all of your cases be the very rarest of cases? So they sent it back and said, you've got to really look at this on a case-by-case basis. So, this is obviously a very powerful, important issue, and it gets implicated in policy and legal decision-making. But it is I think it's a core issue to always be addressed.
So what would you say are some common coping mechanisms for children that come from abusive households?
Well, certainly one is what's called dissociation, which is emotionally disconnecting or cutting off. There's a very eminent psychiatrist, Bruce Perry, who has a sort of evolutionary analysis of this. And basically it is that back in the caveman days, if there was like an attack on your tribe, children who ran away, who fled into the jungle or the forest, they starved to death and died. So they didn't survive and they didn't pass on their genes. Children who fought back were killed by the invading enemy. So they didn't pass on their genes. The ones who did were the ones who went passive, went quiet, went still. And then the invading enemy might say, okay, you're not a problem, we'll take you with us. So they survive, pass on their genes. So it is a very common way, particularly for younger children, to cope. I'll give you an example. A girl once said, who was being sexually abused on a long-term basis by her stepfather, she said, when he first came into the room, I wished I wasn't there. And she said, when it continued, eventually, when he came into the room, I pretended I wasn't there. And then it got to the point where it said, it was as if I wasn't there. And then in her case, it got to the point where she said, I wasn't there. Janie was there. I'm Betty and I was somewhere else. So you can see how this process over time can be a coping mechanism, but it can produce its own difficulties. And because we know now that what we used to call multiple personality disorder is on this continuum of dissociation, and it sort of is an extreme form of that. So in the case of Jenny, she ended up with, having multiple personalities. And so, she could say, I was not sexually abused. I'm Betty, and it was Jenny who was sexually abused. And it may not just be sexual abuse, but physical abuse as well. And I worked on a case where there were brother and sister. The brother was, I think, 2 when this very abusive stepfather came on the scene. The sister was, I think, 7 or 8. He became this sort of irredeemable case because he was so badly abused early on, the first 3 years of life, that he was just sort of beyond reclamation. His older sister used dissociation to cope with it. She survived. She ended up having this multiple personality disorder, which she didn't even know that she had until she was in her 30s. And a friend of hers said one day, "How was your trip to Florida?" And she said, "What trip to Florida?" And her friend showed her postcards and phone records to show that she had been in Florida. And for her, that was sort of the wake-up call that she actually had multiple personalities, and one of them had gone to Florida, and she wasn't consciously aware of it. So that's certainly a big one, dissociation. Another is looking for validation in some group outside your family. And there is evidence that one of the risk factors for joining gangs is that you see in the gang affirmation, love, acceptance that you're not getting at home. And of course, after a period of time, many of those guys realize that it was a false promise and they didn't really get that. It may take to their 20s or 30s to realize that. But that certainly is another way to abuse kids cope, finding someplace else to be treated well and get affirmed and not be rejected or degraded. And of course, there are some who find some positive activity to do. I remember visiting a home. It was just, imagine your worst nightmare of a chaotic, neglectful, abusive home. But there's one kid there who's thriving. She had talent as a track star. And in this horrible place was her little shrine of her track awards, her trophies, her ribbons. And that gave her a positive focus to her life, which ended up being sort of a way to avoid going down this negative pathway. So that's a positive way that kids do cope. Or, but the odds are stacked against you if you come out of that severely abusive family.
So I don't know if this is a question that you'll be able to answer, but are there any current statistics that match violent offenders to violent upbringings?
Well, I would say clearly there are. I'll give you one example that deals in part with violent upbringing. There is a survey called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. It's often called the ACE, ACE. It's 10 questions about sort of bad things that can happen to you growing up. It includes physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, but it also has things like parental separation or divorce, living with someone who's a substance abuser, living with someone who has mental health problems, having a household member go to prison. So it's sort of a lot of bad things that can happen to you. This has been administered to tens of thousands of people in the United States. And it turns out that 2/3 of Americans say yes to either none of these questions or to one. So they get a score of 0 or 1, 2/3, 60-something%. Only 1 in 100 people get a score of 7 or more. Okay, only 1 in 1,000 people get a score of 8, 9, or 10. So that's sort of the baseline. When I interview guys in prison, the average score is 7. So the average guy has got more adversity than 99 out of 100 people. And it's not uncommon to have 8, 9, or 10. It's very rare to have, even 5. A score of 5 still is worse than 87% of the people, 90% of the people. So I think that alone says, if you're looking at violent offenders, odds are you're looking at somebody whose experience of adversity, abuse, abandonment is much, much, much higher than the average population. So to me, that's a starting point to answer that question. And then there are many other studies that find that, as I said before, that being an abused child is the biggest risk factor. Now, it's never a one-to-one correspondence because most people with these high ACE scores do not commit murder. But think about smoking. We've now accepted that smoking, quote, causes lung cancer. But 19% of people who get lung cancer have never smoked. Most people who smoke never get lung cancer. But we say it causes it because it increases the risk dramatically. Smoking accounts for about 14% of the variation in who gets lung cancer and who doesn't. This ACE score accounts for about 50% of the variation in substance abuse, depression, other significant problems like that, and about 30% of the variation in violent behavior. So it's twice as powerful in predicting violent behavior as smoking is in producing lung cancer. Clearly, it's not a one-to-one correspondence because there are these other factors, these situational factors. Are you in a gang? Is there a gang war? Are you dealing drugs? The currency of drug dealing is violence. I remember talking with a couple of detectives in Baltimore, and they were in the homicide division, but they said their colleagues in the substance abuse division, the drug division, would say whenever drugs were stolen or disappeared from a dealer, they could predict the next month that the homicide rate would go up because somebody would get shot or killed or beaten to death for losing the drugs or stealing the drugs. So, if you're in that world, the odds are greater. And then there are these, I interviewed a 15-year-old kid who fired like 20 rounds into a crowded dance, didn't hit anybody. So he doesn't show up as a homicide case, but clearly, that's a very violent thing to do. So there's all of these, what statisticians would call error variants, things where, the connection between the act and the outcome is not a one-to-one correspondence. And of course, there are people who have these high ACE scores who heroically end up being, very pro-social, wonderful people. So there's a lot of intervening influences, I think, that weaken the direct connection, but the overall connection is very clear. If you wanted to have less violence in America tomorrow, if you could prevent every case of child abuse, you would see a dramatic drop. And of course, the other, it's hard not to talk about gender in that murder is mostly a male thing. Although the rate of sort of homicidal aggression has increased for girls, there's still about 90% of all the murders are committed by males. Years ago, I was giving a speech in Iowa, and somebody said, is there some concrete specific thing we could do to reduce the homicide rate in Iowa? And I said, well, yes, there's at least one. You could round up everybody with a penis and move them to Nebraska. And the minute you did that, the homicide rate in Iowa goes down. So I don't mean to demean or make fun of murder, but it does make the point that murder is, predominantly a male activity. And a lot of that is related to, all kinds of male issues. For example, I mentioned that MAOA gene before, that when it's sort of turned off, it's such a risk factor if you're in an abusive family. Well, that gene is on the X chromosome. Now, if you're a girl, you have two X chromosomes, which means if you have this MAOA gene problem on one of your X chromosomes, there's a good chance you don't have it on the other X chromosome, and so you don't see the effect. It's what's called a recessive gene. But if you're a boy, you have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome, and the Y chromosome is almost empty. So if you get that MAOA gene turned off on your X chromosome, for a boy, that means you have the effect because the Y chromosome is basically empty and it doesn't compensate for or balance out. So that alone, should tell us that we should expect more violent behavior in boys than girls because the boys are not playing with a full deck genetically when it comes to this issue. And then you add on the cultural issues and all the rest of it. But this is an enduring, virtually universal effect. Gender is associated with violent behavior and particularly with homicidal behavior.
So you've been called many times as an expert in civil and criminal trials relating to trauma, violence, and abuse. What does all that entail? Is it just giving your opinion on certain acts of alleged abuse or profilers on defendants facing criminal convictions?
Well, civil is included there, but that's, just a tiny, tiny number of cases over 30 years. It's almost entirely criminal. It's almost entirely dealing with murder. And what I'm asked to do is try to explain to a judge or a jury how this individual got from being a baby to being somebody who was involved in, either committed or was just involved in a homicide as a teenager or adult. So it's sort of a developmental analysis tracing their history. Now, typically what you have in these cases, and certainly in the past, was on the one hand, you might have a clinical psychologist who's diagnosing mental health problems in this individual. They have antisocial personality disorder. They have what's called borderline personality disorder, and so on. And then you had a social worker who's providing a social history, which is really a biography of the person. What I found was missing was a sort of bridge between the two. That is, a developmental analysis that uses developmental theory and research to take the social history biography and give it some conceptual underpinning and significance, and to take the clinical diagnoses and get away from just these labels to see what are the underlying developmental issues that come to bear. I'll give you an extreme example. The guy I mentioned before, whose sister had multiple personality disorder, he was a victim of this severe abuse in the first 3 years of life. When you looked at his record, he had something like 11 different psychiatric diagnoses, but none of them started from the fact that this severe abuse in the first 3 years of life had disrupted him in so many ways that you could, if you were a clinician, you could come in and grab a few of them and give it this diagnosis, and grab a few others and give it that diagnosis. It's a bit like the parable of the blind men and the elephant, where blind men are asked to describe an elephant. And one of them grabs the leg of the elephant and says, oh, this is a tree trunk. And one grabs the tail of the elephant and says, oh, this is a rope. And one grabs the trunk of the elephant and says, this is a snake. None of them sees the elephant because they're limited to one little piece. And I thought in that case, certainly the clinicians were just seeing one little piece of this guy, not the whole picture, which only a developmental perspective could shed light on. So that's sort of an extreme example. But generally, for example, a guy who kills his girlfriend, murders his girlfriend when she says she's leaving him. Well, there's a body of research on what's called rejection sensitivity, which has to do with attachment issues in childhood that make you so prone to fearing of being abandoned that when somebody threatens to abandon you or does abandon you, it sort of drives you crazy. An example, a guy who at 39, he woke up one morning, got out his AK-47 and murdered his wife and 2 stepchildren. I mean, totally crazy, totally senseless, until you look at the fact that he was carrying this rejection sensitivity. And then when his wife told him she wanted a divorce, the teenage girl said that, she didn't have to listen to him anymore because he wasn't her real father. And then the little boy discovered who his real father was and was moving in that direction. So for this guy with his, and this would have been challenging for anybody, but with somebody who developed this rejection sensitivity, this was the threat of psychic annihilation. This was all the pillars of his life disappearing from him. And it literally drove him crazy, and he killed them all. So crazy that he couldn't remember doing it. He had what's called dissociative amnesia. He didn't believe he had done it. He thought eventually they would find the guy who he thought must have broken into the apartment and killed his loved ones. He never was able to remember doing this. Of course, if he ever did remember doing it, it'd be very hard to prevent him from committing suicide. Because if he actually understood what he did, it would just be overwhelming for him. So what I try to do is provide a developmental perspective on their lives. What I also do is I start by saying there's a human explanation to this. People say this guy's a monster, or this one is evil. Not, if that's your thing, but my thing is to say, how did this human being get to the point where they did this? And often it sheds light that wouldn't otherwise be shed. It also may offer a path to rehabilitation that people might not think is there. That's particularly true with a lot of these teenagers who are involved in homicide. If you come back 20 years later, 25 years later, not only have they rehabilitated, but some of them become remarkable specimens of human development. And my book, Miller's Children, really talks about that. But if you go back to the assessments done at the time, when they were 16 or 17. They're often written off as being monsters or incorrigible or incapable of human interaction. But it's easy to be blinded, particularly with teenagers, to their potential, because teenagers don't think clearly, they get overwhelmed emotionally, they don't connect thinking and feeling well, they're so subject to peer influences. All these things can make them appear, as really horrible monsters. But when you strip that away over a period of 20 years, when they get a mature brain at 25 and begin to reformulate themselves, you see that they do have the capacity to be something good. I mean, there's really only one study of guys who were released in adulthood who committed murders as teenagers, and virtually none of them committed another crime. So that's very encouraging. That's different from guys. I mean, there is one study that found in Florida, I think it was, where they sentenced teenagers who committed murder. They sentenced them to sentences of 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and virtually all of them, when they were released, committed another crime. And my understanding of that is you've got to wait till they're 25 when they have a mature brain, and then keep them another 10 years so they can use that mature brain to engage in this process. So you often see they have all kinds of infractions, disciplinary infractions, when they first go in, they're in a prison gang, whatever it is. And around the middle 20s, they get to be 25. One guy even said, I woke up on my 25th birthday and said, man, what am I doing wasting my life? And he turned over, became a positive figure. But it takes time. So I think the worst thing for most teenage killers is to just keep them until they're 21 and release them. There may be a few rare cases where that will work, but by and large, that doesn't work, because you're letting them go before they've got the tool to address their experience and the time to address their experience. So that, 30 years ago, when I probably would have said on ideological grounds that teenage killers should be treated in juvenile court. And now, after 30 years of work on this, I would say very rarely should they be treated in juvenile court, because the juvenile court can't keep them under control long enough for this process to unfold. There are some where, the homicide they're involved in as a teenager is the result of an adolescent crisis. They had a good childhood, they were well-behaved in childhood, and something happened in adolescence that pushed them off the deep end. It's often involvement in drugs. Those are guys who can recover relatively quickly. But figuring out if they're one of that group or the other group, is a big challenge that I think a lot of people aren't necessarily up to the task.
How many murder cases would you say that you've testified for throughout your entire career?
I've been involved in testifying, or sometimes as a consultant who doesn't testify, but it's in excess of 300 murder cases now. And I mean, there are cases where I don't testify because the conclusion I draw isn't what the lawyer wants. Because if I reach the conclusion this is one of those exceptions, who can't be rehabilitated, they usually fire me at that point, because they don't want that coming into court. I've virtually always for the defense, because the prosecution doesn't want a jury or a judge understanding this developmental process, and so they don't want me there. I did testify for the prosecution recently in a case where I was originally a defense witness, and the case dragged on for 5 years. And then all of a sudden the prosecution called me because they just wanted one thing. That was the kid, who was 15, had told me that he shot at these people. That's all they wanted to come out. They didn't want why he shot, the context in which he shot, which is typically what the prosecution would not want. So of these 300 plus cases, there are 2, I guess, where I was a prosecution witness. But I'd certainly be open to that. I'd much prefer to be a sort of witness for both sides, as a neutral witness. But as I think that they don't want, in a sense, neither side wants a neutral witness. That's the adversarial nature of the legal system. I think that's about the right number, 300 something.
Is that both state and federal, or just state cases?
Well, most murder cases are state. So it's mostly state. It's probably 90% state. There have been federal cases. I mean, for example, a guy kidnaps somebody in Massachusetts and takes them over the line into Connecticut and murders them there. That might be a federal case because of the kidnapping aspect. Some of the federal cases that are, I don't know if you know what a RICO case is. These are organized crime cases, and some of the gangs have that. MS-13 gang killings, other gangs where there's interstate activity, and those become federal. So there have been some of those, but it's mostly a state case, particularly in the states that still have the death penalty. So I'm in Arizona a lot. I'm in Florida a lot. When I started on cases in Illinois, they still had the death penalty, but while I was working on some of the early cases, they stopped. I was involved in a death penalty case that just stopped because it was no longer a death penalty case. So I do also a lot of cases in Georgia and South Carolina, a couple in Texas, Missouri, Oregon, Idaho. But the three, I'd say the biggest clearly are Arizona, Illinois, and Florida.
So you've been a consultant and advisor with so many different organizations, one being the FBI, which I'd like to talk about rounding out this interview. If you can talk about your work with the FBI, can you tell me what it was that you were consulted about, assuming it had something to do with homicide or abuse of some sorts?
Well, the FBI thing was a short-term thing. It was a sort of meeting about school shooting. It happened, I was involved in the aftermath of the Columbine school shooting in 1999, and actually been involved in a couple of others over the years. So this was an FBI meeting, a sort of brainstorming session about school shooting, and I guess if I remember correctly, other mass shootings, which now have become so commonplace. We have, CNN said we have over 600 a year, so that's almost 2 a day, many of which don't make the news. But so the FBI was very concerned about how to understand school shooters particularly. And I think, one of the messages was that many school shooters actually are best understood as terrorists, that they're committing a terrorist attack against this institution because of what it means to them emotionally or ideologically. So it wasn't a long-term thing, but when I'm introduced, or certainly when I'm introduced in court, the attorneys almost always include, and he was a consultant for the FBI, because it suggests he's not just a lackey of these bleeding heart defense attorneys. But yeah, that was the issue with school shooting.
Did you guys ever come up with any plans or any precautions or anything that's been used to this day?
Well, I'm not sure I recall. And I used to have a sort of certificate from the director of the FBI on my wall just to show that I had been part of this. Back then, 1999, 2000, I think things were just getting going to understand school shooting. There has been progress, since then. That one issue certainly was that most school shooters leak their homicidal intention to other kids. So the first line of defense was other kids. And I remember after the Columbine, a year later, there was a study that asked high school juniors, if some kid talked about shooting people at school, would you tell adults? And 2/3 of them said no. So that really showed what the agenda was to get a willingness to disclose this by other kids because it's so common. Certainly a second thing was that people had to have in their minds that this was a real possibility. I was once on a panel, I sat next to the principal of Columbine High School, and somebody asked the question to him, what did you learn that day? Was it April 23rd, 1999? And what he said, well, if you had told me the day before that there were boys in my school who were so angry and full of rage and that they were planning to try to kill us all, I would have said it was impossible. And the next day it happened. So I think one of the clear messages was you have to entertain the possibility that all over America, there are teenage boys who are disturbed enough, troubled enough, angry enough that they could do this. And they're in your school. And you can't just, and that was one of the messages at this meeting, you can't just think, oh, I'm safe, couldn't happen here. Because certainly back then, after every school shooting, somebody would say, wow, who thought it could happen here? I think we've reached the point now in 2022 where a lot of people, I hope most people say, yeah, it could happen here. And it shouldn't be viewed as some totally exotic, random thing, because there are kids probably in most every school who sympathize, empathize with school shooters. There was I think a website back in the late 90s, early 2000s. If I recall, it was called the Church of Dylan and Eric. And Dylan and Eric were the two school shooters at Columbine. And hundreds of kids logged into this website to say, yeah, I agree with them. I feel the same way. I just am not brave enough to do it. So that I think was part of this consciousness raising about this, to see that there were these kids who were vulnerable to going down this path all over America. And the intervening years have shown that it's true. And of course, it's every time it happens, it's horrible, but it shouldn't be surprising in a way. And that, I think, we still have a lot of work to do. And again, it's I talked about guns before. I wrote a piece for the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of months ago about the impact of gun violence on kids. And one of the points is that whatever else you think about guns recreationally or politically, it seems pretty clear that it's hard to shoot a lot of people with a single action weapon. When you can fire a lot of bullets at one time, it just makes it easier to do this and more difficult to interrupt it before it gets too far in the killing process. So that is something that, that I think, I'll put it this way. I don't know, the comedian Bill Maher, has the show Real Time. I was on his previous show, Politically Incorrect, right after the Columbine thing. But Bill Maher has this segment every week. It's called New Rules. And they're funny, but also they're, make social commentary. I think there should be a new rule, and that is, if you believe anybody in America should be able to have an assault rifle, if you believe they should be just available like that, then the next time there's a mass shooting using one, you are prohibited from being shocked and appalled by it. Because if you believe everybody should have one, then the logical, natural conclusion is they're going to be used by disturbed individuals, and you forfeit your right to be shocked and appalled by it because you're validating the context in which that's going to occur. So that'd be my last word, I guess.
So where can people find you on social media and or check out your published works?
Well, most of the books, particularly the books on this topic, are on Amazon. Listening to Killers, 2015. That's available in paperback on Amazon. It's also translated into Spanish in El Salvador, which has a horrible murder problem. And then the other one particularly is Miller's Children, 2018, both available on Amazon. That's where most people, I guess, go for books like this, rather than, they're not typically in most bookstores because they have limited inventory. So those are the two that I think would be most relevant. I'm the author, editor of 26 books. And there's a book called Raising Children in a Socially Toxic Environment. There's my book, Lost Boys, which is about the emergence of violent behavior in teenagers. That book came out to journalists the day of the Columbine school shooting. So it got, for 2 weeks, I was wall-to-wall coverage on television and radio and newspapers. Sort of from a personal point of view, it was ironic that it was before Amazon and the book was not yet in bookstores. So there was tremendous awareness of the book Lost Boys, but it was hard to get for a while. And by the time they rushed out to bookstores, that the initial interest sort of had waned. If it had happened when Amazon was fully operational, I think it would have been very widely read. It's still pretty widely read, certainly among professionals. So those are probably the three books: Listening to Killers, Miller's Children, and Lost Boys.
Before we conclude this interview, is there anything that you'd like to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
Well, I think just to reinforce the point that there's a human explanation for every murder. And I hate the term senseless acts of violence, because violence makes sense to the perpetrator, at least at the time they're doing it. And you're never going to really make progress in dealing with this unless you start from that. Why does it make sense to this person at the time they do it? Whether it's a school shooter or somebody killing their girlfriend or a gang member, whoever it is, start from that, because it's a human being doing this, and human beings do things that make sense to them, even if we don't think it makes sense or it's warped. But that basic insistence on the humanity of people who commit murder it's not just a moral or ideological stance. I think it's very practical. If you want to understand and improve things, you have to start from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Glad to be with you.
Unforbidden.